Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Thus commandeth the Lord from the mountain top to his people gathered below, and laid down the commandments, beginning with, you shall keep holy the Sabbath day. That is recorded in the heart of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's in the 20th chapter of Exodus. It was even carved into stone tablets that were then put into an ark that could be carried by 2 grown men. And everywhere the tribes of the Hebrews went, that ark either preceded them or followed them, carrying those stones with those 10 commandments engraved on them. They are still operative among Judaism to this day. Like me, some of you, if not most of you, remember the 1950s with some nostalgia. It was a simpler time. Both my parents worked. Periodically, my mother would remind me that we had a roof over our heads, food on the table, and clean clothes to wear. Be thankful. I remember my father sitting at the kitchen table each month, paying the bills, sometimes mumbling to himself, but they got paid. My mother had 2 credit cards, one to Davison's and one to Rich's. They were paid off at the end of each month. They worked, and I went to school. Weekends were for catching up. My mother cleaned house, cooked a Sunday dinner instead of leftovers in the evenings after a day's worth of work. Dad went to the store, had the car serviced, and did chores. On Sunday, it was a day not necessarily of rest, but a Sabbath sacred day. My father was the Episcopalian, the lifelong Episcopalian, so he saw to it that I became one too. He and I went to church on Sunday, he to worship, me to Sunday school, later to a youth group that played a terribly important part in my life as an adolescent. My mother, the good country girl, raised a Methodist in a rural church. She cleaned house and fixed a Sunday dinner. Besides, she didn't like wearing hats, which they did then. Hats to church. Current statistics tell us it is a far different world we live in, a far different society. In the United States, membership in churches is now down to a little less than 35% of the population. Less than 60% acknowledge that they believe in a God. A far different time. Most businesses and entertainment centers are open 7 days a week. You can shop to your content. Anybody can get a credit card, just about. How many are paid off at the end of each month? Sunday especially, the Sabbath has changed. All of the stores are open, all of the theaters, all of the restaurants. Costco and Sam's think it a boom. Our gospel lesson for this morning stands in stark contrast to the life that you and I lead and live in this 21st century. Can you imagine certain religious groups being bent out of shape because a few folks picked grapes while they toured the million-dollar properties at Chateau Hollande? What about the news report? If a surgeon refuses to do a heart transplant because it is Sunday, that's a malpractice suit just waiting to happen. In our gospel lesson for this morning, Mark, our earliest gospel writer, recounts an episode that took place in the earliest days of Jesus' ministry. He's on his way from the countryside into Jerusalem with his disciples. They're hungry. They pick some fruit, some heads of grain to be exact, and nibble on them. This is all observed by the religious conservatives of the day, the Pharisees. And they accuse Jesus that his disciples are breaking the law, the Sabbath law. They are harvesting. They are harvesting. Forbidden on the Sabbath. Jesus reminds them of an episode that took place long ago in Jewish history when David and his followers were forced to flee. How they were hungry and literally broke into the religious shrine and ate the bread that was reserved for the priest. That episode of his being confronted by those Pharisees is exacerbated when he goes into the synagogue and encounters a man with a deformed hand. They're watching to see what he will do. He looks at them and comments on their hardness of heart. Turns to the man and says, "Let me see your hand." And when he holds it out, it is no longer withered. Jesus leaves behind a group of religious, self-righteous zealots who accuse him, and that accusation will follow him his entire ministry, that he is a threat to their belief system. There are some who, to this day, have such a fundamental belief about God and God's law. Pay attention then to what Jesus has to say to them. The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So here we are on the Sabbath. When I was 16 years old, I had saved money for a pretty good while, a little help from my father, and I bought a 1937 Plymouth Coupe. I worked some evenings for a friend, a neighbor, who repaired cars on the side, and over a period of time, I transformed that little Plymouth Coupe into something that was pretty nice. One day in my neighborhood, I came across an acquaintance, he driving a 1940 Ford Coupe. The challenge was there. The drag race ensued. Unfortunately, it was a drag race on Amsterdam Avenue in Morningside, Atlanta. We never saw the police car. The officer got out, said a few things that I cannot repeat, asked for our driver's licenses, and he looked at mine and he kept looking at me and looking at my driver's license, and finally he said, "Is Harold Harrison your father?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "He is a lodge brother of mine." I begged him to take me to jail. He let us go with the assurance that he would keep that day and that date and that episode in the back of his mind every time he went to lodge meeting. And it was the last ticket I got for a few years. The point is that on a much deeper level, you and I need to acknowledge to whom we belong. We need to acknowledge to whom we belong. You and I are each, quote, a child of God, unquote. That title was given to us at baptism. When we are washed in the waters of baptism and the sign of the cross is made on our forehead from that sacred oil, and those words are pronounced in which we are given a name, and we are claimed as a child of God. But we live in an earthly family. We have earthly parents. But ultimately, we are a child of God. And we are marked as Christ's own forever with that cross that is marked on our forehead. And so you and I need to come together routinely, regularly, to acknowledge who we are and whose we are. That we are God's. And that we belong to each other. First and foremost, that is why we come here to celebrate the Sabbath. We may have other reasons. We may be sick and praying for wholeness, or pain in our personal lives, and we need to pray. But first and foremost, we need to come here to acknowledge who we are, whose we are, and our relationship to each other. The Sabbath was made for us, a time set aside to acknowledge our dependency, and that is our purpose and reason for being here. This past Sunday, I returned from a week in northern England are by far the prettiest part of England. It's known as the Lake District, borders Scotland. It is a beautiful, beautiful place, and little towns that are just fun to be in. My favorite town is Grasmere, the home of William Wordsworth. The village church, that Anglican community, has a little sign outside, like we do with churches here, when it was started. The church was founded in 547 A.D. Sits on the beautiful edge of town beside a beautifully flowing creek. The banks of that creek grow cattails, or what I call cattails. It was the practice of that village church every year to grow those cattails and then to cut them at a particular time and begin drying them out. And the last week in June, the village would assemble first and foremost to make as much ale as they could, and secondly, to prepare those cattails to be laid as the floor of the parish church. The whole village gathered. That church nowadays has a walkway that encircles the property, and every stone in that walkway has the name of one of those parishioners, all the way back to the beginning of that parish register. Times when people couldn't read or write, but they are there. That is that community of faith. There is a sign that hangs over the door going into the side of that chapel about those stones. It reads, "These are the faithful ones who have graced us with their lives." These are the faithful ones who have graced us with their lives. Those were the ones who gave their hearts and lives to the community in which they lived. And so Sabbath is our time to thank God for life and for our brothers and sisters who gather here regularly. As the song says, we are the saints of God. Remember what Jesus told the Pharisees. The Sabbath was made for humankind, you and me, and we are the saints of God. Thanks be to God.
Amen.